Why was she even there? That was the first question that hung in the air like smoke, unanswered, ignored, avoided. A woman with no rifle, no call sign, no reputation in the barracks. Captain Lauren Hayes wasn't supposed to carry a weapon, wasn't supposed to get close to the ridge where the real work happened. She was an observer, a desk officer, an analyst with clean boots and a notebook meant for documenting what the operators did, not someone who bled beside them. But the mountains didn't care who she was supposed to be. The Hindu Kush stretched in front of her, ancient and merciless, sharp ridgelines cutting across the horizon like scars. At 9 in the morning, the sun already burned hot enough to peel skin if you lingered too long on exposed rock. Wind came down in punishing gusts, twisting, clawing, carrying dust devils in slow spirals before dying into silence. And then it would return from the opposite direction, sharper, colder cutting. It was a wind that mocked certainty. Lauren stepped down from the lead truck, boots crunching on stone that threatened to slide with each step. She moved carefully, steady, her balance precise. She wasn't tall, she wasn't broad. She blended into the scenery with a kind of deliberate plainness. Early 30s blonde hair locked in a bun so tight that not a strand escaped under her helmet. Her vest carried compact binoculars, a radio, a sidearm holstered low but unopened. No long rifle slung over her shoulder. No exotic optics. Nothing about her said she belonged among men who lived and died by the trigger. And yet she carried herself differently. She wasn't adjusting her footing like the others, wasn't shifting against the wind. She stood as if she knew how the mountain breathed, head tilted, listening, as if there was something in the silence only she could hear. Chief Warrant Officer Jake Collins noticed. He always noticed. 38 years old, seasoned to the bone, every movement stripped down to efficiency. His seals spread out with no wasted motion, setting into positions without a word. He'd led them in a dozen fights where one mistake meant you went home zipped into aluminum. He trusted them with his life. But headquarters had sent someone else along this time, someone he hadn't asked for. Someone in pressed fatigues without scars, with a pen instead of a rifle. He gave her the professional courtesy of acknowledgement, but just barely. "You got what you need, Captain?" he asked, voice clipped, eyes already moving back to the ridgeline. "I do," she answered simply. That was it, no smile, no over-explaining, just enough to leave the air heavy with unspoken doubt. The others weren't so restrained. "Perfect," muttered Martinez, shouldering past with his rangefinder. "Brass sent us a desk jockey to watch us work." He didn't bother lowering his voice. Lauren didn't react. She lifted her binoculars and leaned into a spine of fractured rock, glassing the valley below. She'd learned long ago that silence was its own answer. Through the lenses, the world resolved into layers, pale talus spilling down like sand, dark limestone carved into caves staring like blind eyes, a dry riverbed stitched with stubborn shrubs that had learned to survive where little else did. But it wasn't the terrain that held her attention. It was the movement of the air itself. Heat shimmered above the rocks, distorting everything like glass. Every 30 seconds the wind shifted, snapping north to south, pausing, then slashing back again from another angle. Lauren counted under her breath. 1, 2, 3. The valley was breathing sideways. Meanwhile, the snipers took their positions. Jackson and Wilson, men whose names carried quiet respect in this unit, set up with precision. Data cards checked, scopes adjusted, rifles braced against stone. They shot from mountains before. They trusted their calls in harsher winds than this, or so they thought. The first shot cracked. "Miss," Jackson said flatly, working his bolt. Wilson cursed, squinting into his scope. No way. That was solid. Wind call was good, dope was perfect, target was standing there like he wanted to be hit. He fired again. The round sparked harmlessly off limestone. The fighters below scattered with quick discipline, fading into cracks and shadows as if rehearsed. "That's two," Collins muttered, jaw tightening. Another rifle opened up from Parker's position. The rhythm doubled, high then low, left then right. Every shot was answered by empty stone, by echoes that mocked their aim. 6 rounds, 8 rounds. The target stayed untouched. 6 shots, Collins said through gritted teeth. They know we're here. And now the trap began to close. Return fire escalated, deliberate, walking up the slope. Bursts of AK fire stitched across the rocks, each one closer, more accurate. Dust sprayed across their positions. Martinez ducked low. "They're bracketing us," he hissed. Then came the sound no one wanted to hear, the hollow cough thunk of mortar tubes. The first impact landed wide, throwing dirt into the air. The second fell short. But the third was perfect. It punched into the slope close enough that shrapnel cut Wilson's face and knocked Jackson onto his back, blood seeping from his shoulder. Collins felt the moment slipping. He'd been here before, missions collapsing in seconds, control bleeding away faster than you could reclaim it. His men were pinned. The wounded couldn't move fast enough. The route down was exposed. Every option meant casualties. And then in the chaos, a calm voice cut through. "You're shooting into a thermal funnel," Lauren said, eyes still locked through her binoculars. "The gust splits, one draft climbs, one falls. Every round's walking in 2 directions." Wilson shot her a look sharp enough to wound. "We'll adjust. Don't need a lecture from the peanut gallery." But her words hung in his head, whether he wanted them to or not. Another shot cracked wide again. The fighters below pressed harder, disciplined and relentless. Smoke trails, suppressive bursts, coordinated fire. Whoever had planned this wasn't improvising. This was a rehearsed kill zone. "They're not scattered," Lauren said quietly. "They're layered." Collins turned, face streaked with dust and frustration. "What did you say?" She lowered the binoculars at last and met his eyes. "Interlocking fields of fire. Whoever planned this knew exactly where you'd set up. They've drilled this. This is a trap built for you." As if to punctuate her words, another mortar round slammed close enough that the concussion knocked gear off ledges and left ears ringing. Collins stared at her, a flicker of realization dawning. How did she know that? How was she reading the enemy like a script? Lauren's hands were already moving. She made the slightest adjustment to a weapon none of them had even realized she carried. A suppressed rifle, compact, built into the shadows of her kit. She clicked 2 notches left, timed her breathing to the valley's shifting winds, and squeezed. The shot was almost too quiet to register. But down below, a fighter with an RPG crumpled before he could fire. Martinez blinked. "What the hell?" Before anyone could process, her scope shifted again. Another shimmer, another flicker of movement. Crack. Another man fell. Even Jackson, clutching his bleeding shoulder, whispered the question none of them could ignore. "Who is this woman?" Lauren's finger eased against the trigger reset. Her voice stayed calm, almost detached. "The person keeping you alive." Another shot, another figure down. And in that moment, that sudden reversal, something shifted inside the pinned SEAL team. Not because they had the numbers, not because of heavier weapons, but because the quiet, unarmed observer they dismissed as a liability was dismantling the trap with surgical precision. For the first time since the ambush began, survival no longer felt like a fading hope. It felt possible. Collins didn't know whether to be angry, relieved, or in awe. But as enemy fire slowed and his men regrouped, one truth settled over him like the dust still hanging in the air. Sometimes the person you least expect is the one you need the most. What made her different? That was the question scratching at the back of Collins' mind as another of her shots echoed low and final. His men had trained for years to master wind calls, to conquer distance, to make impossible shots routine. And yet, they were missing. She was. Lauren Hayes shouldn't have been here. On paper, she was a logistics officer, someone who lived behind spreadsheets and supply chains, not scopes. And still, the way she moved, the way she adjusted to the valley's cruel breath, it was like she'd known this fight long before they walked into it. Collins clenched his jaw, He didn't have the luxury of curiosity. Men were bleeding. Mortars were still hunting them. He barked orders, repositioned his element, forced momentum back into the firefight. That's what leaders did when the ground tilted under their feet. They steadied it, even if their own heart was pounding too loud to hear anything else. But even as his team fought, the rhythm shifted. Not because of him, because of her. Lauren lay behind fractured stone, face impassive, breathing slow, every shot an act of patience. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't panicking. She was dismantling the battlefield, one choice at a time. And the SEALs, despite their pride, began to feel themselves moving with her cadence. Still doubt festered. "Who is she?" Jackson whispered again, wincing as blood seeped through his makeshift bandage. "No way she's just logistics." "Doesn't matter right now," Collins snapped, though part of him wanted that answer too. "What matters is she's hitting." Martinez ducked as a burst of AK fire chipped rock near his head. "Yeah, but hitting like that, in this wind, come on, Chief, that's not luck, that's—" He stopped, not finding the word. "Experience," Lauren said without looking up. She cycled her bolt, reset, fired again. Down in the haze, another figure folded, weapon clattering from his hands. No one argued with her after that. But silence doesn't erase emotions. Wilson felt his pride sting hardest. He was the shooter, the man others relied on when angles grew impossible. To watch a so-called analyst outshoot him in the same conditions was humiliation wrapped in awe. He pressed his face into the stock again, trying to force steadiness, but the scope swam. The wind mocked him. Sweat stung his eyes. Every miss felt heavier than the last. And in that weight, something dark stirred, the fear of being useless. Lauren didn't gloat. She didn't look his way. She just kept breathing with the valley and pulling the trigger when the world aligned. But her restraint only made it worse because she didn't need to prove herself. She already had. Wilson whispered a curse under his breath, adding the sound of it. Collins heard him and almost said something sharp, but stopped. This wasn't the time to tear open wounds, not when the mountain was already doing it. Then came another sound, sharper, closer. The pop of rifles repositioning in shadow. Enemy fighters were tightening their noose. "They're pushing high," Parker called out, "trying to cut our flank." Collins scanned quickly, gauging movement. They were being herded. The enemy had rehearsed this trap well. He had seconds to make a choice. Pull back and risk exposing the wounded, or stand and bleed for time. Neither option was clean. Before he could decide, Lauren's voice cut in, low and certain. "They're not just pushing high. Watch the smoke." He frowned, following her binoculars. Sure enough, white phosphorus grenades ignited below, clouds billowing into the wind. To most, it was concealment, chaotic, blinding. But she was watching the way the smoke shifted, where it bent thin, where it thickened. "They're masking movement," she continued. "But it's not random. They're steering it. Left flank first, then collapse right. They'll pin you into the saddle." Collins' gut went cold. She wasn't guessing. She was reading the enemy like a man reads his own handwriting. "How the hell do you know that?" he demanded. Lauren didn't answer. She simply fired again. Through the smoke, a flash of muzzle had betrayed its source for less than a heartbeat. Her bullet cut the moment short. The figure dropped. Martinez stared. Impossible, she just shot through a wall of ghosts. "Not ghosts," Lauren said softly, "patterns." It unsettled them, that calmness, that certainty. The more she spoke, the more they realized she wasn't discovering the enemy plan. She was recognizing it, and recognition meant history. But what history? The mountain roared again with mortars, closer this time. Shrapnel tore into Parker's shoulder, ripping fabric, hot metal biting flesh. He grunted, teeth clenched, blood slick on his sleeve. Wilson cursed, crawling toward him, trying to bind the wound with shaking hands. They were unraveling. Even with Lauren's precision, the weight of numbers was pressing down, second by second. Collins felt it in his bones, the fragile balance between survival and slaughter. And then in the chaos, a flash of memory hit him. A briefing months ago. A name that had surfaced, then vanished. Rumors of a program buried under layers of clearance. No insignia, no record. People who were sent where logistics wasn't enough. Collins shoved the thought aside. He didn't have time for ghosts. But when he looked at Lauren again, stone still behind her rifle, eyes narrowed, movements precise as mathematics, the rumor didn't feel so far away. The fight dragged on. Minute by minute, shot by shot, they clawed space to breathe. Lauren cut down forward observers and the mortar fire thinned. Without spotters, the enemy's artillery grew blind. That small victory let the SEALs reposition, dragging their wounded behind cover, buying seconds of survival. Still, the enemy pushed. A burst of gunfire ricocheted inches from Collins' head, showering him with fragments. He pressed lower, heart hammering. His men looked to him, but for once, he wasn't the one turning the tide. That truth burned deeper than he cared to admit. Lauren chambered another round. Commanders always reveal themselves, she murmured, almost to herself, even when they think they don't. She scanned high on the eastern wall where shadow cut across jagged stone. For an instant, sunlight caught on something metallic, a reflection, brief, gone in a blink. But it was enough. Collins saw it too, a radio antenna. "Wait," he began. But she was already locked in. Her breathing slowed, shoulders rising and falling in rhythm with the valley's breath. She didn't fight the wind. She rode it. Her finger brushed the trigger. Crack! 680 meters away, a figure fell backward into shadow. And everything changed. The fighters below faltered, movement suddenly uncoordinated. Without their leader, their discipline cracked. Fear began to seep where training had once held. They fired, but the rhythm broke, and fear made them predictable. For the first time since the ambush began, Collins felt something shift inside his chest. Hope. But even as the balance turned, Lauren's eyes narrowed again. She'd seen something else. A different threat, deeper in the valley. Two figures moving with deliberate care, setting up something heavy. A long rifle, powerful enough to reach their extraction point. Her blood ran cold. If that weapon locked on, survival would be an illusion. And Collins saw her expression change, the calm cracking just enough to reveal the truth. Not fear for herself, fear for them. Before he could speak, she moved. She broke cover, sprinting down the slope, drawing fire instantly. Bullets snapped past, sparking stone, buzzing her ears. She moved low, fluid, fast, as if she'd done it 100 times before. No hesitation, no second thought. "Cover her," Collins roared, the order ripping from his throat. The SEALs unleashed everything they had, suppressing every muzzle that dared follow her. It was chaos, deafening, desperate. And in the middle of it, Lauren ran alone, a silhouette against the valley, chasing the weapon that could end them all. How do you run toward death when everyone else is diving for cover? That was the question that cracked through Collins' mind as he watched her break from the ridge. She was out in the open, stone and dust exploding around her with every impact, yet she moved as if the mountain itself bent to shield her. Not fast, not frantic, controlled, deliberate. Lauren's boots found purchase on ledges that would have sent another soldier tumbling. Her body hugged the terrain like water rushing downhill, using every fold of earth as cover. She wasn't just running, she was remembering. Because she had done this before. The valley blurred into fragments, shouts, gunfire, the hollow scream of wind. But beneath it, another memory surfaced uninvited. A different battlefield, a different war. The heat then had been heavier, humid, clinging to the lungs. She'd been younger, less hardened, but the pattern was the same. The sense of walking into something rehearsed, something meant to kill everyone but her. She shook the thought off. The past wasn't supposed to follow her here. Logistics was supposed to be safety. Numbers, supply lines, fuel charts, predictable things that didn't bleed. She told herself she'd left this part of her life behind. But the truth was standing in front of her now, assembling a weapon big enough to end them all. Her rifle hugged her chest as she slid behind a cluster of boulders. Dust filled her mouth. Her heart hammered, but not with panic, with focus. She peered around the edge. There they were, two fighters working fast, practiced hands setting up a heavy sniper rifle. A long barrel glinted in the brutal sun, a scope adjusted with care. They weren't just taking pot shots. They were establishing dominance over the valley. Once they locked in, extraction would become suicide. Lauren's pulse slowed, as if her body knew panic was useless. She thumbed the safety, adjusted her scope. The air shimmered again, waves of distortion bending everything like heat off asphalt. Patience, wait, let the valley breathe. A fighter leaned to feed the weapon. The wind shifted. She timed the pause. Crack! The loader dropped before he realized what had happened. The second man froze, disbelief written in every movement. He grabbed for the weapon, tried to swing it. Lauren shifted aim, exhaled, fired again. Crack! Silence! The long rifle lay abandoned. But she didn't move. Not yet, because another memory gripped her unbidden. The last time she'd run like this, into fire, against orders, against reason, it had been for someone else. A voice she still heard at night, broken by static over a radio. Someone who hadn't made it out. Someone she'd promised herself she'd never fail again. Her throat tightened, but she forced the thought back down. Survival wasn't about what you carried with you. It was about what you buried until later. Gunfire yanked her back into the present. Fighters were adjusting, shifting toward her, realizing where the threat had moved. Muzzle flashes winked from the haze. Bullets cracked close, too close. Lauren ducked low, rolling into a shallow depression. Her chest heaved. The air tasted of stone and cordite. Her sidearm was suddenly in her hands, as if muscle memory had pulled it free without permission. A shadow rose at the edge of her cover, a fighter, rifle aimed. She squeezed the trigger twice, two sharp reports. He collapsed. Another darted from the smoke, charging reckless. She pivoted, sights aligned, fired again. He fell, momentum carrying him into the dust. Every shot she fired carried a weight she refused to show. She wasn't here to prove herself. She wasn't here for pride. She was here because if she didn't do this, no one would. Up on the ridge, Collins shouted for his men to keep pressure on the enemy. They fired controlled bursts, covering her movement, hearts pounding as they watched the so-called observer fight like one of their own. No, not like one of them. Different. Sharper. Jesus Christ, Martinez muttered, almost to himself. She moves like she's been doing this her whole life. She probably has, Collins growled, though the admission tasted strange. Wilson pressed against the stone, rifle ready, but his eyes followed her with a nod of envy and awe. His pride hurt, but even he couldn't deny what he was seeing. Whoever she was saving them. Lauren reached the carcass of the heavy rifle, kicked it aside. She crouched low, scanning for more. The valley writhed with smoke and distortion. It was a battlefield designed to break men, but to her, it was a puzzle, cruel, yes, but solvable. Her comm crackled with Collins' voice. Captain Hayes, pull back, you're too deep. She almost laughed at the order. Too deep. She'd been deeper in places worse than this, but she understood his fear. He wasn't just commanding his men anymore. He was trying to command her. Not yet, she answered. Her voice was flat calm, carrying something that unsettled even him. Another burst of fire hammered her position. She pressed closer to the stone, grit cutting into her cheek. Her hand shook for the briefest moment, not from fear, but from memory. For a second, she saw not the mountain but another field, another body falling, someone she hadn't saved. She swallowed hard, focus, not then, now. The enemy shifted again, using the smoke as their ally. She scanned, eyes narrowing, searching for breaks, patterns, any betrayal of movement. And there, a flicker, a silhouette crossing where smoke thinned for half a breath. Crack. Gone. Her breathing steadied again. The valley was cruel, but it always told the truth if you watched long enough. Above her, Collins' team rallied behind her fire. The wounded stayed low, grimacing through pain, while Martinez called out targets she cut down one after another. The rhythm of survival had changed. It wasn't panic anymore. It was endurance. And still, questions gnawed at them all. Why was she here? Why had headquarters really sent her? And why did she look at the valley not with fear but with recognition? Collins chewed on those questions as he reloaded, heart pounding. He'd led men long enough to know when someone carried secrets. And Lauren Hayes carried hers like a second weapon, silent, hidden, but deadly when drawn. Down in the dust, she shifted position again, sliding behind another outcrop. Her muscles ached, lungs burned, but her face betrayed nothing. She was determined, but beneath that determination was something else, something heavier. Because every shot she fired wasn't just against the enemy in front of her. It was against the memory of the ones she hadn't saved, against the silence of a voice that never came back over the radio, against the guilt that logistics was supposed to erase, but never did. She wasn't here to prove she belonged. She was here to make sure no one else was lost because of hesitation. And maybe, just maybe, to redeem herself in her own eyes. The valley didn't care about redemption. It breathed hot and jagged, indifferent to the lives clawing for purchase on its slopes. But in that indifference, Lauren found clarity. If the mountain wasn't going to give them mercy, she would. She rose from cover, sighted again, and fired. Another body fell. Collins' men felt the shift. For the first time, they weren't just surviving. They were following her lead. And none of them dared say it out loud. But the thought rippled through every mind on that ridge. Maybe she wasn't sent to observe them. Maybe she was sent to save them. What kind of person walks into fire with steady hands? Collins kept asking himself that as he watched her from the ridge, each precise shot tearing seams in the enemy's net. She wasn't just buying them seconds anymore. She was unraveling the trap itself. But no one fights like that without history. Lauren slid behind a jagged outcrop, chest heaving, cheek pressed to stone. Dust caked her lips, the taste of iron heavy in her mouth. The battlefield noise dulled for a moment, like the valley itself was holding its breath. And in that pause, memories she hated surfaced. She remembered the first time she'd been told she didn't belong. Fresh uniform, hair too neat, voice too soft. They'd laughed in her face, those men with calloused hands and predator eyes. They'd told her she'd last a month, maybe two, before breaking. But she hadn't. She'd lasted years. Years spent in the shadows of units that didn't officially exist, where missions never appeared on paper, where mistakes were buried alongside bodies. Years when her name was never spoken outside briefing rooms. She'd lasted, but she hadn't walked away unscarred. A voice cut through her thoughts, sharp with pain. "Movement 3 o'clock," Martinez shouted. She blinked, snapped back into the present. Through her scope, she caught the flash of a barrel, the outline of a figure shifting between rocks. Her finger tightened. Crack. Gone. She exhaled slowly, forcing the memories back into the dark. On the ridge, Collins' men were holding tighter now, their fire sharper, their fear steadier. They were following her cadence without realizing it. Every time she called out a target or shifted her angle, they adjusted too. But Collins felt something deeper than tactical alignment. He felt the fragile pride of his team straining. These were men forged to lead, to dominate fights, to be the standard others measured themselves against. And yet today, they weren't the standard. A woman they dismissed, as a desk officer was carrying them on her back. He looked at Wilson, whose jaw was set so hard it looked like stone. The sniper's pride was bleeding, but there was something else behind his eyes now, the slow, reluctant respect of someone who knew denial couldn't last forever. Another burst of AK fire cut across the slope, forcing Martinez flat. Shards of stone peppered his helmet. "They're regrouping," Parker called through clenched teeth, blood seeping into his sleeve. Collins swore under his breath. They'd bought breathing room, but it wouldn't last. Enemy numbers were still too strong, and every second they stayed pinned here, their chance of extraction shrank. Lauren's voice cut in, calm as ever. They're not regrouping, they're relayering. Her binoculars tracked movement through the haze, reading the battlefield like sheet music. Fighters shifted in pairs, one suppressing, the other moving. They weren't panicking anymore. They were adapting. "They'll try to box you again," she said. Collins ground his teeth. "And what do you suggest?" For the first time, she looked up from her optics, eyes locking with his. They weren't cold. They weren't hard. They were tired. The kind of tired you only carried if you'd been here too many times before. "Change the rhythm," she said. Her meaning hit him in the chest. She wasn't just describing tactics. She was describing survival itself. You couldn't keep playing the enemy's song. You had to break the music before it swallowed you. But before Collins could ask what she meant, the valley answered with another punishing burst of fire. Lauren ducked low, dust blasting across her face. She clenched her teeth, eyes closing for half a second too long, and in that darkness another memory broke free. A different valley, different fighters, a night raid where she hadn't been the observer but the point of the spear. The mission had gone wrong, a breach mistimed, a call made too late. She fought through it, body moving with the same precision it did now, but not everyone had walked out. One had stayed behind. She still saw his face sometimes in dreams that left her drenched in sweat. A teammate who'd trusted her, who'd believed she would never hesitate. And she hadn't hesitated. But the world had, and in that hesitation he'd been lost. The guilt had gnawed at her ever since. Logistics had been her escape, a way to bury that part of herself in paperwork and supply lines, where no one died if she made the wrong call. But the mountain wasn't letting her hide anymore. She snapped her eyes open, forcing the memory back. There would be time for ghosts later. Right now, there were living men depending on her. She popped from cover, scope locked, fired. A fighter fell mid-sprint, weapon tumbling. Martinez risked a glance toward her. His voice shook, but not with fear, with disbelief. "Captain, what the hell were you before this?" Lauren didn't answer, not directly. Her gaze swept the valley, her finger tightening against the trigger again. "The person they sent," she said softly, "when logistics wasn't enough." The words landed heavier than any bullet. Collins froze, breath catching. That rumor again, clawing back into his mind. That whisper of units without names, missions without records. She fired again. Another figure crumpled in the dust. And Collins realized something that chilled him to the core. She wasn't just here to observe. She wasn't here by accident. She was here because someone in headquarters knew this mission could go sideways and had sent the kind of insurance policy that didn't exist on paper. But if that was true, then what did it mean about the mission itself? What had they walked into that required someone like her? The questions tightened his chest, but he shoved them down. Survival came first. Answers could wait. Another mortar round boomed, shaking the ridge. The blast threw Wilson against the stone, ears ringing. He groaned, half-conscious but alive. Lauren's rifle cracked again, silencing another spotter before they could correct fire. The mortars went quiet. The SEALs held their ground, every man bleeding or bruised, but none willing to break. Collins wiped blood and dust from his face, forcing his voice to stay level. "We can't stay here. Hayes, if you've got more of those patterns in your head, now's the time." Lauren lowered her rifle for the first time in minutes, eyes scanning the valley with something close to sorrow. She didn't answer right away. She let the silence stretch, heavy and thick, like she was weighing more than just terrain. Finally she spoke. "There's always a way out, but it costs." The words hung there, cold and honest. Collins stared at her, heart thudding. Costs? What kind of costs? But before he could ask, the mountain erupted again, gunfire sharper, closer, fighters pressing harder. The enemy wasn't broken yet. not by a long shot. Lauren slid back behind her scope, jaw set, eyes cold now. Whatever history she carried, whatever ghosts haunted her, they would have to wait. Because right now, the only thing between Collins, team and death was the quiet woman they'd underestimated, and the secrets she hadn't yet revealed. What did she mean by cost? The words hung in Collins' chest like a weight he couldn't shake. His men bled beside him. Smoke curled across the valley, and the only one who seemed certain of survival was the woman they dismissed hours ago. Lauren didn't answer him, not fully. She pressed her cheek back to the rifle, eyes narrowing, body melting into stone. Another shot cracked, precise, final. A fighter dropped in the haze. But even as she fired, her mind wasn't entirely in the Hindu Kush. It slipped, unbidden, to another place, another time. She hadn't wanted to remember, but the mountain, with its twisting winds and punishing silence, didn't ask permission. It had been a night mission. Different country, different war. Black sky broken by tracer fire, air thick with dust and the stench of diesel. She had been younger then, still believing that training could prepare you for chaos. Still believing you could do everything right and walk everyone home. Her team had breached a compound where intelligence promised high-value targets. She'd been point that night, the one who moved first through the breach. The room exploded with gunfire. She moved without hesitation, her weapon finding shapes before thought caught up. Her training had carried her. Her instincts had been sharp, sure. But instincts hadn't been enough. She could still hear it, the cry over comms, the sharp crack of a rifle too close, the sudden silence that followed. A teammate, younger than her, newer than her, but someone who had trusted her eyes when his own faltered. She'd been meters away. Just meters. But when she turned, when she fired, when the threat fell, it was too late. She had seen him drop, his body folding, his voice cut off mid-word. And no matter how many missions followed, no matter how many times she'd pulled the trigger after that, she had never escaped that silence. That night after exfil, she'd sat in the darkness of a transport, helmet in her lap, hands shaking. And when the report had been filed, she'd made her choice. Logistics. A clean assignment. A quiet assignment. Somewhere no one would die if she miscalculated. But some truths don't stay buried. They follow you. They wait until the next ridge, the next ambush, the next set of faces looking at you for answers you thought you left behind. The mountain dragged her back to the present. A burst of fire snapped against the rocks above her, showering grit across her helmet. She blinked hard, breath-catching. Martinez's voice cut sharp. They're flanking left, trying to climb. Collins swore, adjusting his fire. The SEALs shifted, strained, their rhythm fragile again. Wilson tried to line up another shot, but his shoulder trembled from blood loss. His pride wanted to help, but his body betrayed him. Lauren adjusted her scope, tracing the flankers' movement. She waited. One exposed a shoulder for a fraction too long. Crack, he dropped. Another froze, ducked, then made the mistake of leaning out again. Crack, gone. Collins glanced at her, a mix of awe and suspicion grinding in his chest. She was saving them, but she was also carrying secrets he couldn't ignore. Hayes, he growled between bursts of fire. What unit were you with before logistics? Her finger hovered against the trigger, steady. Her eyes stayed on the valley. The kind that doesn't leave traces, she said softly. And that was it. No explanation, no patch to sew on, just a truth wrapped in silence. Collins cursed under his breath, not in anger at her, but at the reality he was starting to accept. She wasn't here to observe. She was here because someone knew his team might not come back. And someone in Washington had decided the only way to tip the scale was to send a ghost in uniform. Another figure darted through smoke, weapon raised. Lauren fired without hesitation. The man fell before his finger touched the trigger. But her calm wasn't without cracks. Every time she pulled the trigger, she felt the weight of that night again. Every time she hit, she remembered the one she hadn't. She carried that silence like shrapnel in her chest, sharp and unmovable. She whispered almost to herself, "Not this time." Collins heard her. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. He'd seen enough soldiers haunted by ghosts to recognize one when she spoke. The enemy pressed harder, desperate now, their coordination fraying without their commander. But desperation could still kill. Bursts of fire swept the ridge. A ricochet clipped Martinez's helmet, spinning him sideways, dazed but alive. Parker grunted in pain, blood soaking through his bandage. Jackson tried to steady his breathing, wounded shoulder screaming with every movement. They were hanging on by threads. Lauren shifted, chambered another round, adjusted for the valley's cruel breath. Crack! Another enemy dropped. But for all her precision, she knew it wasn't enough. Numbers wore down even the sharpest blade. She couldn't kill them all. And that was when the words she'd spoken earlier clawed back into her mind. There's always a way out, but it costs. She swallowed hard, steadying her breath. She knew what that meant, she always had. Because survival in places like this wasn't free. It demanded payment, sometimes in blood, sometimes in secrets, sometimes in the parts of yourself you never got back. Her scope found another figure, another threat. She fired, and the silence after the shot carried the same old echo. On the ridge, Collins watched her, jaw set. He wanted answers, but more than that, he wanted his men alive. And right now, that meant trusting the ghost they'd been sent. He reloaded, pressed against the stone, and muttered low, as much to himself as to her. "Who the hell are you, Captain?" She didn't answer. She couldn't, because part of her wasn't in this valley at all. It was still in that compound years ago, still hearing the silence of a man she hadn't saved. And that silence was the reason she refused to let any of them fall today. Not this time. Never again. What does guilt weigh? For Lauren, it was heavier than the rifle pressed against her shoulder, heavier than the plate carrier digging into her ribs, heavier than the mountain itself. Every time she sighted down her scope, every time her finger tightened against the trigger, she carried it. The memory of one man's silence, the promise she'd made in the dark. Never again. Gunfire hammered the ridge. Dust rained down, choking, blinding. Collins shouted orders, voice raw. His men fought with everything they had left, but exhaustion was setting in, pain leaking through their discipline. Jackson's face was pale, sweat cutting rivers through blood and grime. Parker's breathing grew ragged, the wound in his shoulder darkening with each passing minute. They were holding on, but just barely. And through it all, Lauren moved like the valley's heartbeat, precise, relentless, unyielding. She tracked another fighter as he ducked between rocks, waited for the breath, the pause, the tiny mistake. Crack! He dropped, body folding silently into the dust. Martinez risked a glance her way, eyes wide, face streaked with sweat. You're not human," he muttered, disbelief cracking in his voice. Lauren didn't look at him. She didn't respond. She couldn't, because she knew exactly how human she was. Too human. Human enough to still hear the voice that never answered back. Another burst of fire tore across the slope, forcing Wilson down hard. His pride had long since bled out with his strength. He didn't even try to line up another shot. His rifle felt like a stranger in his hands now, heavy and useless. He looked at Lauren instead, jaw trembling. "Who trained you?" he whispered hoarsely. Lauren's finger reset against the trigger. Her eyes stayed on the valley. "The kind of people who don't train you to survive," she said quietly. "They train you to disappear." Wilson didn't ask again. He just stared, unsettled in a way no firefight had ever unsettled him. Collins pressed against the rock, watching her between bursts of fire. He wanted to demand answers, to tear the truth from her with the force of command. But even he knew that some truths don't come when asked. Some truths arrive only when they're ready, and when they do, they change everything. For now, he needed her more than he needed answers. "Hayes," he shouted over the gunfire, "how many more?" She scanned, her binoculars moving with unnerving calm. Her voice was flat when she replied. Too many. It wasn't despair. It was honesty, cold, sharp honesty that cut deeper than false hope. Collins clenched his jaw. His men looked at him for direction, but all he could do was nod, grit his teeth, and keep firing. The enemy pressed harder. Coordinated movement, disciplined fire. Even without their commander, they weren't breaking. They'd rehearsed this ambush too well. And yet for every move they made, Lauren answered. Her shots weren't wild. They weren't hurried. They were deliberate, each one a subtraction in the enemy's equation. Still, she felt the weight growing heavier. Not the rifle, not the fight, the weight of her own mind. She buried the past for years, tucked it beneath layers of logistics reports and supply briefings. But the mountain had stripped those layers away. Out here, under the brutal sun, she was nothing but the woman who'd failed once and who refused to fail again. She remembered his face, not clear, never clear, always half-shadowed like memory itself was afraid to look straight at him. She remembered the trust in his voice, the way he'd said her name without doubt, without hesitation. And she remembered the silence that followed when she hadn't been fast enough. Her throat tightened. Her eyes burned, but she didn't let the tears come. She trained herself not to. Instead, she poured it into the rifle. Crack, another man down. Crack, another muzzle silenced. Each shot was a penance, an apology she could never speak. On the ridge, Jackson whispered, voice thin with pain, "She's carrying something." Collins didn't answer. He didn't need to. They all saw it. The way she moved, the way she fought, the way her eyes never wavered but never softened either. She wasn't here for glory. She wasn't here to prove herself. She was here because she couldn't bear not to be. The valley erupted again, a sudden surge, fighters charging up the slope, desperation pushing them harder. Collins shouted, his men firing back with everything left in their rifles. Muzzle flashes lit the smoke. The air filled with the scream of ricochets, the hiss of bullets slicing too close. Lauren shifted fast, sidearms snapping free, close quarters now. A fighter appeared above her, rifle raised. 2 shots controlled pairs, he dropped. Another rushed, screaming through the haze. She pivoted, fired once. Silence. Collins' heart pounded as he watched her move. Not frantic, not wild, calculated. Every step, every pull of the trigger was rehearsed, but not rehearsed here, not with them. Somewhere else, somewhere darker. He shouted over the chaos, "Hayes, why send you?" She didn't look at him. She put another man down instead, then another. Finally she spoke. Her voice was low, heavy, stripped bare. Because sometimes the only way to save a team is to send someone who doesn't belong to it. The words sank into him like stone. And in that moment, Collins understood what she'd meant about cost. She wasn't talking about bodies. She was talking about herself. The weight she carried, the life she'd given up, the silence she lived with every day. Her shots slowed, not from exhaustion but from precision sharpening. She wasn't just firing anymore. She was choosing. Every round was a vow, every impact a promise. Never again. Not this time. The enemy's surge faltered. Men dropped, momentum broken. Fear rippled through their ranks, visible even through the smoke. Their discipline cracked. They hesitated. And hesitation in a fight like this was death. Lauren lowered her rifle for a breath, chest rising and falling. The weight inside her pressed harder, but for the first time she felt it shift. Not lighter, never lighter, but shared. Because when she looked back at the ridge, at Collins and his wounded men, she saw something in their eyes that hadn't been there before. Not doubt, not contempt, not even surprise. Respect. She wasn't one of them, she never would be. But right now that didn't matter. What mattered was that they were alive, because she refused to let them be anything else. How long can a person carry the fight alone? Collins asked himself that as he pressed into the stone, lungs burning, weapon hot. His men were exhausted, wounded, holding on with grit alone. And beside them, no, ahead of them, Lauren Hayes kept cutting the valley down piece by piece. But even she had limits. The enemy wasn't finished. Not yet. Desperation makes men dangerous, and the ones still alive in that valley weren't fleeing. They were regrouping, shouting orders in languages the SEALs couldn't follow, but Lauren seemed to understand without translation. She didn't flinch, she didn't slow. She scanned the haze, her breath sinking with the valley's cruel rhythm. Crack! A man fell from the rocks. Crack! Another muzzle went silent. But for every one she dropped, two more pressed forward. Smoke thickened. Shadows darted. Gunfire rattled the stones like hail. "They're pushing again," Martinez shouted, panic edging his voice. Collins felt it too. The enemy was throwing everything they had left into one last surge. If it broke through, if they swarmed the ridge, there would be no holding them. His men didn't have the strength for another hour of this. They barely had minutes. "Hold the line," he barked, forcing authority into his voice even as doubt gnawed at him. Lauren didn't echo his command. She didn't speak at all. She rose from cover, rifle steady, eyes sharp. Her body moved with the precision of someone who knew there was no fallback, no retreat. Because she wasn't just fighting to win. She was fighting to erase the silence that haunted her. The first of the enemy cresting the rocks saw her silhouette and raised his weapon. She fired first. He crumpled. The second rushed, wild-eyed, screaming, his rounds scattering wide. She pivoted, dropped him with two clean shots. But there were more, so many more. Collins' men poured fire into the surge, their rifles chattering, magazines burning empty. Jackson fought through the pain in his shoulder, one-handed, his teeth gritted against the scream threatening to escape. Parker leaned into his rifle despite the blood soaking his sleeve, every trigger pull an act of stubborn defiance. Wilson, pale and shaking, forced himself upright, sighted down his scope. His pride was broken, but not his will. He found one target, squeezed, missed, then corrected, fired again. This time the figure dropped. "Got one," he muttered, almost in disbelief. Lauren didn't glance his way, but she felt it. The tide inside the team shifting. They weren't just watching her now. They were fighting with her. The valley roared back, bullets sparking off stone, shrapnel tearing the air. A round snapped so close past Lauren's ear it felt like the mountain itself had screamed. She ducked, rolled, came up firing. Crack! Another man gone. But her body was slowing. She felt it in her arms, in her lungs. Each shot weighed heavier than the last. Each movement carried the drag of exhaustion. She pushed it down, but the truth gnawed at her. She couldn't carry this forever. And then the enemy overplayed. In their desperation, they pushed too fast, too hard. Their surge lost coordination. Fighters broke from cover, sprinting reckless up the slope. Lauren saw it, the pattern collapsing, the precision gone. Fear had taken hold. "Now," she shouted, the first real command she'd given all day. Collins didn't hesitate. He rallied his men, voices hoarse, weapons firing in brutal unison. The ridge exploded with controlled fury. Every SEAL poured what was left of himself into the fight, every burst measured, every shot deliberate. And Lauren led them. Her rifle cracked again and again, each round carving another hole in the surge. She didn't waste bullets. She didn't rush. She cut the valley apart with surgical calm, even as her chest heaved, even as sweat stung her eyes. Martinez roared, emptying a magazine into the smoke. Wilson steadied, shaking, and dropped another figure through grit and blood. Jackson, pale but unyielding, kept his rifle steady despite the pain ripping through his body. Collins fired until his weapon clicked dry, then slammed another magazine home, fury and survival welded together. The enemy faltered, men dropped, men hesitated, and hesitation spread like fire through dry grass. Lauren's scope found the last pockets of coordination, men shouting, waving, trying to hold the line together. She breathed with the valley one last time. Crack! One leader down. Crack! Another. And then suddenly silence. Not complete. The wind still screamed, the mountain still shifted, but the fire from below was fractured, scattered, broken. The surge collapsed. Fighters scrambled backward, dragging the wounded, retreating into the smoke that had once hidden their advance. The valley was no longer a trap. It was emptying, bleeding chaos into silence. On the ridge, the SEALs lowered their weapons slowly, disbelief settling in heavier than the dust. Their ears rang, their bodies trembled, but they were alive. Collins leaned against the stone, chest heaving. He stared down at the valley, then at Lauren. She was still crouched, rifle steady, scanning for threats. Her body was trembling now, the adrenaline finally catching up, but her eyes were sharp as ever. Martinez dropped beside her, panting. They're pulling back," he said, half in shock. Lauren didn't answer. She didn't celebrate. She just exhaled, long and slow, the sound carrying more weight than any words. Collins looked at his men, broken but breathing, and felt something shift inside him. Respect, gratitude, and something harder to swallow, humility. Because the truth was undeniable. They hadn't survived because of him. They hadn't survived because of training or tactics or firepower. They'd survived because a woman who wasn't supposed to be here had refused to let them die. She lowered her rifle at last, resting it across her lap. Her hands shook just a little. Her eyes closed for a breath too long. Collins wanted to say something, to thank her, to demand answers, to acknowledge what she had just done. But the words caught in his throat. Because how do you thank someone who just saved your life with a skill set you didn't know they carried? How do you demand answers from someone who clearly carried ghosts heavier than bullets? He stayed silent. And in that silence the mountain breathed again. The wind shifted, dust swirled, and the echoes of the firefight faded into memory. Lauren opened her eyes, scanning the valley one last time. Then she whispered, so soft only she could hear. "Not this time." What happens after the shooting stops? That was the question no one asked aloud, but every man on that ridge felt hanging in the air. The silence after violence isn't peace. It's something heavier, harder to carry. The valley had gone quiet. Smoke curled from fractured stone. Brass casings glinted in the dust like scattered teeth. The air still smelled of cordite and blood. Collins lowered his weapon at last. His arms shook, but not from fear. From exhaustion, from the weight of survival. He scanned his team. Jackson pale and bleeding, Parker barely holding consciousness, Wilson hollow-eyed, Martinez bruised but steady. They were alive, battered, broken, but alive. And then his gaze fell on her. Lauren sat low against a boulder, rifle across her knees, head bowed. Her hands trembled just enough to betray what she'd hidden all day. Her breathing was slow, deliberate, like she was forcing herself back into control. Collins moved closer, boots crunching against stone. He stopped a few feet away, words caught in his throat. Gratitude, questions, maybe even apology. But when she lifted her head and met his eyes, he said none of it. Because he saw the weight she carried. He saw the ghosts clinging to her like a second shadow. This wasn't victory for her. This wasn't triumph. It was survival, and survival always costs. Martinez sat down heavily beside Wilson, ripping off his helmet, sweat streaking his face. He glanced at Lauren, then at Collins. "Chief," he said quietly, she just saved every one of us." Collins nodded once, slow. The words were true, but they weren't enough. Down below, the valley stirred with faint movement. Fighters retreating deeper into caves, dragging the wounded, abandoning the field. The battle was over. For now. A distant rumble reached them, rotors beating the thin mountain air. Extraction. The sound should have been relief. To Collins it was. To his men it was. But to Lauren it felt different. It felt like the closing of a door. The helicopter crested the ridge, kicking dust into a storm. The SEALs shielded their eyes, hauling the wounded toward the landing zone. Collins shouted orders, voice carrying over the deafening thunder. Lauren stood slowly, slinging her rifle with practiced ease. She walked toward the bird with no rush, no urgency, just steady steps as if she'd already begun fatting. Wilson reached into his pocket as he stumbled past her, fingers brushing against something warm from the sun, a spent brass casing he'd picked up during the fight. Her brass, her shot. He held it out to her. "This is yours." She looked at it, then at him. Her eyes softened for the first time all day, but she shook her head. "Keep it," she said. "Remind yourself that sometimes you have to change the rules to win the game." Her voice was calm, but it carried a weight that pressed into Wilson's chest. He closed his fist around the casing, silent. Martinez, hauling Jackson toward the bird, glanced back at her. "We're never gonna see you again, are we?" She didn't answer. The helicopter roared louder, its crew shouting, hands reaching to pull the wounded aboard. Parker gritted his teeth as he was lifted inside, Jackson collapsing against the deck with a groan of relief. Collins climbed in last, turning back one more time. Lauren was already seated, helmet in her lap, eyes fixed on the valley below. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The bird lifted, blades tearing at the sky. The valley shrank beneath them, scars of the fight fading into distance. Spent brass, blood on stone, smoke curling from caves. The evidence of survival scattered by the wind. Inside, silence settled heavier than the engine's roar. The SEALs sat in contemplative stillness, each man lost in his own thoughts. They knew they owed their lives to her. They knew she wasn't what she claimed to be. But none of them spoke. Jackson broke the silence first, voice quiet, almost reverent. "We're never gonna see her again, are we?" Martinez shook his head slowly. "People like that don't stick around for debriefs. They just disappear." Collins sat across from Lauren, studying her in the dim light of the cabin. She stared out the window, the mountain reflected in her eyes. He wanted to ask. He wanted to know who she really was, what unit, what command, what ghost she carried. But he didn't, because some questions are better left unanswered. Respect doesn't always need explanation. The helicopter banked, turning toward base. The valley fell away behind them, swallowed by distance and time. Lauren leaned back against the seat, closing her eyes, the weight of the rifle across her lap, the hum of the rotors vibrating through her chest. For a moment, she let herself breathe. Not relief, not peace, but something close. She thought of him again, the one she hadn't saved. She thought of his silence, the ghost that had followed her through every deployment, every sleepless night. And for the first time in years, she felt that ghost shift. Not gone, never gone, but lighter. Because this time, no one had been left behind. She didn't smile, she didn't cry, she just breathed. The men sat in silence with her, their eyes heavy, their bodies broken but their respect undeniable. And as the bird carried them back toward base, back toward the endless churn of reports and debriefs and missions yet to come, one truth settled deep in their bones. Never assume the quietest person in the room is the least dangerous. Sometimes, the quietest one is the reason anyone makes it home at all. And sometimes, dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.